Chapter 28. Notes and Queries 7 8 508. A correspondent who had been to Devonshire writes for information as to a story that he had heard there, of an occurrence of about 35 years before the date of writing. A snow upon the ground of all South Devonshire, waking up one morning to find such tracks in the snow as had never before been heard of. Clawed footmarks, or an unclassified form alternating at huge but regular intervals with what seemed to be the impression of the point of a stick, but the scattering of the prints, amazing expanse of territory covered, obstacles such as hedges, walls, houses seemingly surmounted. Intense excitement that the track had been followed by huntsmen and hounds until they had come to the forest, from which the hounds had retreated, baying and terrified, so that no one had dared to enter the forest. Notes and Queries 7 9 18. Whole occurrence well remembered by a correspondent. A badger had left marks in the snow. This was determined as the excitement that had dropped to a dead calm in a single day. Notes and Queries 7 9 70. That for years a correspondent had had a tracing of the prints which his mother had taken from those in the snow in her garden in Exmouth, that they were hoof-like marks but had been made by a biped. Notes and Queries 7 9 253. Well remembered by another correspondent who writes of the excitement and consternation of some classes. He says that a kangaroo had escaped from a menagerie. The footprints being so peculiar and far apart gave rise to a scare that the devil was loose. We have had a story, and now we shall tell it over from contemporaneous sources. We have had the latter accounts first very largely for an impression of the correlating effect that time brings about by addition, disregard, and distortion. For instance, the dead calm in a single day. If I had found that the excitement did die out rather soon, I'd incline to accept that nothing extraordinary had occurred. I found that the excitement had continued for weeks. I recognized this as a well-adapted thing to say to divert attention from a discorrelate. All phenomena are explained in the terms of the dominant of their era. This is why we give up trying really to explain and content ourselves with expressing. Devils that might print marks in snow are correlates to the third dominant back from this era. So it was an adjustment by 19th century correlates or human tropisms to say that the marks in the snow were clawed. Hoof-like marks are not only horsey but devilish. It had to be said in the 19th century that those prints showed claw marks. We shall see that this was stated by Professor Owen, one of the greatest biologists of his day, except that Darwin didn't think so. But I shall give reference to two representations of them that can be seen in the New York Public Library. In neither representation is there the faintest suggestion of a claw mark. There never has been a Professor Owen who has explained, he has correlated. Another adaptation in the later accounts is that of leading this discorrelate to the old dominant into a familiar scenery of a fairy story and discredit it by assimilation to the conventionally fictitious. So the idea of the baying, terrified hounds in forests like enchanted forests which no one dared to enter. Hunting parties were organized, but the baying, terrified hounds do not appear in contemporaneous accounts. The story of the kangaroo looks like adaptation to needs for an animal that could spring far because marks were found in the snow on roofs of houses. But so astonishing is the extent of snow that was marked that after a while another kangaroo was added. But the marks were in single lines. My own acceptance is that not less than 1,000 one-legged kangaroos, each shod with a very small horseshoe, could have marked the snow of Devonshire. London Times, February 16th, 1855. Considerable sensation has been caused in the towns of Topsham, Lipstone, Exmouth, Teignmouth, and Dawlish in Devonshire in consequence of the discovery of a vast number of foot tracks of a most strange and mysterious description. The story is of an incredible multiplicity of marks discovered in the morning of February 8th, 1855, in the snow by the inhabitants of many towns and regions between towns. This great area must, of course, be disregarded by Professor Owen and the other correlators. The tracks were in all kinds of unaccountable places, in gardens enclosed by high walls and up on the tops of houses as well as in the open fields. There was in Lymphstone scarcely one unmarked garden. We've had heroic disregards, but I think that here disregard was titanic. And because they occurred in single lines, the marks are said to have been more like those of a biped than a quadruped. As if a biped would place one foot precisely ahead of another, unless it hopped, but then we have to think of 1,000 or of thousands. It is said that the marks were generally 8 inches in advance of each other. The impression of the foot closely resembles that of a donkey's shoe and measured from 1.5 inches in some instances to 2.5 inches across. Or the impressions were cones in incomplete or crescentic basins. The diameters equal diameters of very young colts' hoofs, too small to be compared with marks of donkeys' hoofs. On Sunday last, the Reverend Mr. Musgrave alluded to the subject in his sermon and suggested the possibility of the footprints being those of a kangaroo. But this could scarcely have been the case, as they were found on both sides of the Este. At present it remains a mystery, and many superstitious people in the above-named towns are actually afraid to go outside their doors after night. The Este is a body of water 2 miles wide. London Times, March 6, 1855. The interest in this matter has scarcely yet subsided, many inquiries still being made into the origin of the footprints which caused so much consternation upon the morning of the 8th ult, in addition to the circumstances mentioned in the Times a little while ago. It may be stated that at Dawlish a number of persons sallied out, armed with guns and other weapons, for the purpose, if possible, of discovering and destroying the animal which was supposed to have been so busy in multiplying its footprints. As might have been expected, the party returned as they went. Various speculations have been made as to the cause of the footprints. Some have asserted that they are those of a kangaroo, while others affirm that they are the impressions of claws of large birds driven ashore by stress of weather. On more than one occasion, reports have been circulated that an animal from a mangaree had been caught, but the matter at present is as much involved in mystery as ever it was. In the Illustrated London News, the occurrence is given a great deal of space. In the issue of February 24th, 1855, a sketch is given of the prints. I call them cones in incomplete basins, except that they're a little longish. They look like prints of hoofs of horses, or rather of colts, but they're in a single line. It is said that the marks from which the sketch was made were 8 inches apart, and that this spacing was regular and invariable in every parish. Also, other towns besides those named in the Times are mentioned. The writer, who had spent a winter in Canada and was familiar with tracks in snow, says that he had never seen a more clearly defined track. Also, he brings out the point that was so persistently disregarded by Professor Owen and the other correlators, that no known animal walks in a line of single footsteps, not even man. With these wider inclusions, this writer concludes with us that the marks were not footprints. It may be that his following observation hits upon the crux of the whole occurrence, that whatever it may have been that had made the marks, it had removed rather than pressed the snow. According to his observations, the snow looked as if branded with a hot iron. Illustrated London News, March 3rd, 1855-214, Professor Owen, to whom a friend had sent drawings of the prints, writes that there were claw marks. He says that the track was made by a badger. 6 other witnesses sent letters to this number of the news. One mentioned but not published is a notion of a strayed swan. Always this homogeneous seeing, a badger, a swan, a track. I should have listed the other towns as well as those mentioned in the Times. A letter from Mr. Musgrave is published. He, too, sends a sketch of the prints. It, too, shows a single line. There are 4 prints, of which the third is a little out of line. There is no sign of a claw mark. The prints look like prints of longish hooves of a very young colt, but they are not so definitely outlined as in the sketch of February 24th, as if drawn after disturbance by wind or after thawing had set in. Measurements at places 1.5 miles apart gave the same interspacing, exactly 8.5 inches apart. We now have a little study in the psychology and genesis of an attempted correlation. Mr. Musgrave says, I found a very apt opportunity to mention the name kangaroo in allusion to the report then current. He says that he had no faith in the kangaroo story himself, but was glad that a kangaroo was in the wind because it opposed a dangerous, degrading, and false impression that it was the devil. Mine was a word in season and did good, whether it's Jesuitical or not, and no matter what it is or isn't, that is our own acceptance that, though we've often been carried away from this attitude controversially, that is our acceptance as to every correlate of the past that has been considered in this book, relatively to the dominant of its era. Another correspondent writes that though the prints in all cases resembled hoof marks, there were indistinct traces of claws, that an otter had made the marks. After that, many other witnesses wrote to the news. The correspondence was so great that in the issue of March 10th, only a selection could be given. There's a jumping rat solution and a hopping toad inspiration, and then someone came out strong with an idea of a hare that had galloped with pairs of feet held close together, so as to make impressions in a single line. London Times, March 14th, 1840. Among the high mountains of that elevated district where Glenarchy, Glenlyon, and Glen O'Shea are contagious, there have been met with several times during this and also the former winter upon the snow the tracks of an animal seemingly unknown at present in Scotland. The print in every respect is an exact resemblance to that of a fowl of considerable size, with this small difference perhaps that the sole seems a little longer or not so round, but as no one has had the good fortune as yet to have obtained a glimpse of this creature, nothing more can be said of its shape or dimensions. Only it has been remarked from the depth to which the feet sank in the snow that it must be a beast of considerable size. It has been observed also that its walk is not like that of the generality of quadrupeds, but that it is more like the bouncing or leaping of a horse when scared or pursued. It is not in one locality that its tracks have been met with, but through a range of at least 12 miles. In the Illustrated London News, March 17, 1855, a correspondent from Heidelberg writes upon the authority of a Polish doctor of medicine that of the Pishwoga Gora sandhill, a small elevation on the border of Galicia, but in Russian Poland, such marks are to be seen in the snow every year and sometimes in the sand of this hill, and are attributed by the inhabitants to supernatural influences. Interesting. That does it. I'll start new lands soon.